Joining us this evening is Busang Manewe of Bohopa and Manewe Attorneys. Busang, welcome to First Issues and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Busang, can you explain to our viewers in layman's language what is conflict of interest?
Conflict of interest is a criminal offense that is made criminal by the Corruptions Act of 1996. It arises where a member or an employee of a public body which has to determine any issue or business transaction related to a company in which that particular member or employee of a public body has interest, but then he fails to declare that interest. That's basically what the law says on conflict of interest.
What kind of interest are we talking about here?
The interest can be direct interest or indirect interest. One can be deemed to have interest simply because it's related, it's a blood relation of one of the directors of a particular company. Or secondly, he can be deemed to have interest where he stands to benefit financially from the company that the public body deals with.
The Act criminalizes failure to declare conflict of interest. Is there a way in which it can be minimized, if not avoided?
Well, there are various ways to minimize the incidence of conflict of interest. The very first one is let's say you are dealing with a tendering process or procurement. You can have in that tender document a provision prohibiting or barring certain individuals from participating in the tendering process. That's one way of trying to minimize the incidence of conflict of interest. And further, you can have internal policies, rules and regulations, which seeks to counter the occurrence of conflict of interest.
For example?
Say you belong to company A. That company can come up with conditions of service which would ensure that they guard against the occurrence of conflict of interest.
What is the worst that can happen should a key member not disclose their interest in a certain decision that is being taken?
Well, certainly he will fall foul of the criminal offense of conflict of interest, and the consequences are very dire in the event that the state intends to press charges against that individual. The offense is so serious that the legislator has found it fit to put the penalty at 10 years imprisonment, or alternatively a fine of 500,000, or a combination of imprisonment and fine. It will basically depend on the court as to what penalty it should met out. But the ceiling is 500,000 in terms of fine, or 10 years in terms of the jail term, or it can be a combination of the two.
Would this also apply to business transactions, or is it for a specific kind of transaction?
In many instances, conflict of interest arises in business transactions, such as maybe a company in respect of which your spouse is a director would tender, and the other spouse would sit on the other side in the board to determine whether that very company gets the tender or not.
Now, Busang, say I do declare my interest. Does that mean I can have the go-ahead to participate, for example, in the tender, like you mentioned earlier?
In terms of the law, if you're an employee or a member of the public body, and you find yourself in a situation where there exists conflict of interest, what you have to do, you have to declare your full interest in that company to the authority and the disclosure must be in writing. It will not suffice if the declaration is verbal. It doesn't stop there. Then the authority should permit you to take part in the proceedings. That is the catch. You must actually be permitted to take part in proceedings. And in terms of the criminal law, what then that means is that you can bring it up as a total defense to a charge of conflict of interest.
Is the Act strict in enforcing this law?
Well, I don't see anything wrong with the Act, but then what you should be saying is, are the people charged with authority to enforce the law doing enough?
Are they?
I would say so, within the limitations and the weaknesses in the law as it stands. They're doing the best they could.
What other alternatives exist to minimize this conflict of interest? Can we say learn from other countries?
Yes, you can learn from other countries. The very, very first thing that weapon that one can use to combat the scourge of conflict of interest, which basically is corruption, is to be as transparent in our business deals as we possibly can. And this transparency can be achieved through people with interest, say politicians, say our leaders and judges, magistrates, and all those who have to deal with issues of determining tenders would have to declare their interest to the public. There must be a proper mechanism to ensure that the declaration is in writing, it's full, and it's in a public document which can be accessed by each one of us in the public, so that to dispel the myth that our leaders are corrupt, so and so is corrupt.
If a member of the public were to feel that there was no transparency, things were done a little bit hidden, what steps can they take to rectify?
Obviously, it's in a very, very painful position. The best that person can do is to report his suspicion to the DCEC or the corruptions body or the Botswana police. But then, because of the fundamental flaws that we have in our laws, where we don't have Access to Information Act, there is no way he's going to access certain crucial information which will further fortify his belief or position that indeed some corrupt process has taken place. But you can only do so if the enabling act such as access to information. I would want to believe that if I have suspicion that Mr. So-and-so is corrupt, or he corruptly got a tender, and I try to go to the authorities to get full information, they will say, no, who are you? What interest do you have? Besides, you are not under any duty to disclose the information to you. But if we have an act such as Access to Information Act, I'll be fully armed with that act to go and confront the authorities.
Are you saying all is lost? Because I cannot go and say, can I please have the information of what this person owns and does not own?
Well, I would say the lack of legislation on access to information, lack of a situation where there is no declaration of assets, are serious impediment to transparency, and it is a breeding ground for serious suspicion. And to me, the stumbling blocks to effective combating of corruption and conflict of interest.
The Access to Information Act that you just mentioned, what is it? Do we have it in Botswana?
Unfortunately, we don't have Access to Information Act in Botswana. It's basically, it's there in many other countries, of course in other liberal democracies. And it basically entails a situation where everyone